I'm Tamara, and today I am going to walk you through 4 different stitches that you can do with your sewing machine so that you can attach your applique onto whatever project you are working with. I just finished making this table runner behind me here. I love how it turned out, and I used 2 different stitches. No, wait, I used 3 of these stitches just to do that applique project alone. If you're interested in this project, I will have that project linked in the description down below. Now for this tutorial, I do want you to note that you can use different needles depending on the different fabric that you're using, but also depending on your project. So for myself, I just used an all-purpose needle and I was perfectly happy with how it turned out. Some people like to use an embroidery needle when they're doing these projects. I believe that's a number 75 needle, and I will have those linked in the description down below. One more very important thing that you should know is if you are doing a thicker stitch like this satin stitch here, you may need to add a stabilizer to the back of your fabric. If you are not using a stabilizer, what can happen is your fabric can start to pucker up. So I do recommend using either a tearaway stabilizer or even what I did here. I just used some fusible fleece on the back of my project. I used some fusible fleece on the back of this table runner here, and it worked out great. Now let's jump into this tutorial and learn the differences between all 4 stitches so you can figure out which one you want to use. A straight stitch is a great stitch to start with if you are learning applique for the first time. It'll allow you to learn how to pivot and go slow and just get comfortable with applique before trying any of the fancier stitches. Now if you're doing a straight stitch, what I recommend that you do is you will lower your stitch length to around a 1.5 to a 2. So for myself on this heart, I actually used a 1.8 stitch length. Now as you can see here, I'm using an open toe sewing foot, and I use that sewing foot for all 4 stitches. This is a very helpful sewing foot to have, and I will have it linked in the description down below. This sewing foot allows you to see exactly what you're doing so you can make sure that you are going along the edge of your project. Now you can see here I'm also going slow. I am not speeding up the process of this filming for you. That way you can see in real time what I'm doing here. The nice thing about a straight stitch is it's not that hard. All you have to do is go slow and pivot often. One thing about a straight stitch though is that it can create a lot of fraying along the edge of your project. As you can see along that left edge that I've just finished, it's almost forced the fabric to fray a little bit. Now if you want to avoid that fraying, what you can do is use one of the next stitches that I show you. Now if you are new to applique, I want you to notice as I get closer to this center corner of the heart, I'm actually starting to use my hand wheel so that I can have a little bit more control over where my needle ends up within that point before I pivot. I chose to use black thread for this project so that you could see what I am doing. And if you look to the right of that heart, you'll see that there's a little knot there. And that knot is because I started the straight stitch using a back stitch. And so when you go all the way around your applique project, you will start and stop with a back stitch and you'll end up with that little knot. Now, if you're choosing to use a thread that hides within your applique, the same color, matching color, then the knot might not be such a big deal. But if you're using a thread and you will end up seeing that start and stop point, what I suggest you do is you will bury the threads to the back of your project. Now I will show you exactly how you will do this at the end of this tutorial. So at the end of all 4 stitches, I will show you how you can bury your threads to the back if you don't want to see that knot on your applique. I find a straight stitch is best used for beginners who are getting comfortable with applique, as well as those that are trying to sew around a really odd shape. So I like to cut out different prints from different fabrics, like this little snowman here. And I find that if I were to use a blanket stitch or any of these other stitches, it would just get a little bit awkward. So I would use a straight stitch in that instance, but otherwise I tend not to use the straight stitch because these next 3 stitches I find to just be a little bit more superior. Depending on the size of your applique project, it will depend on how large of a zigzag you may want to use, but for the most part I would set my zigzag stitch to a 0.5 length and a number 2 for width. Now if you are working on very narrow areas like like my Halloween applique project here, you will see on the teeth that the larger the zigzag, the more it covers the actual applique pieces. So just keep that in mind when you're choosing the width of your zigzag stitch. And now for the actual applique, you will start by putting your needle on the outer edge of your applique piece, and you will start going slowly around your project. Now, when you are going around an outside curve, you will stop with the needle on the outside of your project, and you will slowly pivot your fabric. Obviously, you'll be lifting your presser foot up as you're doing this. And then when you're doing an inside curve, you're actually going to stop with your needle on the inside of your applique project, and then you will pivot from there. Now, when you get to a point, like the point on this heart here, what you want to do is you actually want to sew a little bit past your point, and you will stop on that outer edge with your needle, and then you can pivot your fabric. And the reason why you sew past is because when you pivot your fabric, then when the needle wants to go back towards the fabric, it will naturally go across or further into your applique. So another thing that you can do is you can actually pick up your presser foot and just adjust your project just a tiny bit, you know, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, so that you know that the needle is going back down into your applique. This takes time, this takes practice, but you can do it. Now with a zigzag, when you come to an inner point, I try my very best to end up on the outer edge of that point. Before I pivot, I like to do one zigzag towards the center of the project, and then I'll pivot again and I'll continue down the line. Again, if you find your needle is not going to end up in that exact spot, you can lift up your presser foot, pick up your needle out of the fabric, and move it just 1 millimeter to the direction in which you want your needle to land, and then continue from there. That allows you to get the precision that sometimes you need in a particular corner. Now, of course, with this zigzag stitch, you will end up with a tiny bit of fraying as well, but not half as much fraying as you would with your straight stitch. And once you've finished your applique project, again, you can always finish with a back stitch, but if you want to learn how to bury those threads to the back of your project, I will show you that at the end of this video. Before we jump into my favorite applique stitch, I did want to ask, if you're finding this tutorial helpful at all, please hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so that you don't lose me on YouTube. All right, let's get to that blanket stitch. The only thing about the blanket stitch is, depending on your sewing machine, you can actually end up with a bunch of different types of blanket stitches. Some of them like to move back and forth a lot of the time, and so I suggest that you choose the most simple and basic blanket stitch that your sewing machine has. Preferably, it does not go backwards at all, it only moves forwards. Now you will see in my tutorial, my stitch does go backwards once, and that's just because I don't have a regular blanket stitch, oddly enough. So I might have to fiddle with my settings. But the one thing that we can all do is we can set our stitch to the correct length. So for myself, I like to set the stitch length to around 1.6 and the stitch width to 2. You will start on the outer edge of your project and you will pivot often. But every time you pivot, you have to make sure that your needle has stopped on the outer edge. That's very important. And that's for outer curves and inner curves. So that's a little bit different than the zigzag stitch. If you were to stop with your needle on the inside of your applique project and then try and pivot, what you'll end up doing is you'll create a V within that stitch. So that's why we say you have to stop on the outer edge when you're doing the blanket stitch. Now, it's difficult to plan where your needle is going to stop once you get to a point. So similar to the zigzag stitch, I will lift my needle up and I will adjust my fabric a tiny bit, 1 millimeter if necessary, to get my needle to land exactly where I want it. When you end up getting to a point, you'll try to end with the forward straight stitch and then pivot, but only pivot halfway. That way the blanket stitch, the part that's going into your applique, you can make sure that that goes into the point, and then you can pivot again and carry on around that corner. You will see this displayed a little bit better when I get to the center corner of this heart. All right, so as I'm heading into a inner corner, I'm going to again try my best to land that needle into that center point. But if I can't, I will finagle that needle a little bit to get there. And then I will only pivot halfway. That way I can get that blanket stitch down the center of that inner corner. And then I can pivot again and carry on down the line. So that's what I was trying to explain when I was talking about that bottom point. You'll do the same thing on an inner corner or an outer corner with a blanket stitch. And again, you can burr your threads to the back if you'd like, or you can do a back stitch. And now for the satin stitch. This stitch will take up a lot of your thread and a lot of your patience. Some of you may have an actual satin stitch on your sewing machine, but you can always create a satin stitch by adjusting your zigzag. And I would adjust your zigzag to a length of 0.1 and a width of 2. Now the reason why you don't want to go all the way down to a length of 0 is because what can happen is your needle will continue to go back and forth, but your machine really isn't pulling your fabric forward at all. So you'll just create a really big lump. And you definitely don't want to do that. Now, something that you need to be very aware of with a satin stitch is you will actually stop on the outer edge of your applique when you are doing outer curves. And then when you're doing inner curves, you're going to stop on the inside of your project and slowly pivot and adjust that way. So that is similar to the zigzag stitch, but different from the blanket stitch. And the biggest thing about a satin stitch that you need to know is that you need to go slow. If you start pulling on your fabric or you up your speed because you're just getting frustrated, you will end up with a applique wheel like this image here. And that's because I was getting tired of doing my applique. I was in a hurry. I was too excited and I wanted to see my project done. And now I've got a wonky wheel. So the satin stitch looks gorgeous. It will of course stop any fraying that you're trying to avoid. So I find the satin stitch is best for those that just hate any fraying. And then one more thing that you need to know about a satin stitch is when you are doing a corner, you will actually sew past the corner to the width of your stitch. So we've set the width of our satin stitch to a 2. So you will try to sew that length past your point before you pivot. That way when you pivot and the needle tries to go back, it won't go past your applique project. Now you'll see that best when I go into the inner corner of the heart. This point is actually quite pointy, so I ended up having to finagle it the way that I've described in those previous stitches, where you can lift your needle up and then just adjust your fabric a millimeter or so before hand cranking that needle back down where it needs to be, and then carrying on with your project. And as you can see here, I'm not stopping at the inner edge of that corner, but I am sewing past it, that stitch width. That way I am stopping where it started and I am creating a really nice point in that corner. And once again, you can finish with a back stitch or you can bury those threads, which is what I am finally going to show you next. Now, the most important thing that you need to know when trying to bury those threads is that you need to start with long tails of thread. So pull that bobbin thread towards the back of your sewing machine and give yourself about 5 to 8 inches worth of length. And you'll do the same with your top thread. Pull both threads towards the back of your sewing machine so you don't end up sewing over them, and you can start sewing your applique project. Remember, of course, do not backstitch when you start. And then when you get to the end of your applique project, you do not want to sew over the ends that you started with. So make sure you stop before you sew over the seam that you started with. And then of course end by making sure that you have long threads again at the end of your project. So again, you'll want another 5 to 8 inches worth of thread, and then it's time to turn your project over. And now for myself, I like to use my sewing stiletto, and it is my favorite, so I will link it in the description down below if you're interested in finding one similar to that. Or you could use a long needle, and what you're going to do is just pull up where you started and where you stopped until you see a little loop. And that little loop, you'll just pull your needle or your stiletto on through. And that loop is pulling those threads from the front to the back of your project. And once all of your threads have been pulled to the back of your project, then just tie them in a neat little knot and then clip the excess threads so that you've got yourself about a 1 to 2 inch tail. Now those tails can still be seen through towards the front of your project, depending on your project, of course. So what I suggest you do is grab some fabric glue, and I will link to this fabric glue in the description below, and you'll just glue those threads so that they are angled towards the center of your applique project, so they will be nicely hidden away in your project instead of poking out. I do have a few more helpful tips that I want to share with you now, one of which is the fact that I shared particular stitch width and stitch lengths in these tutorials with you. But if you are sewing a much larger applique project, you can adjust those stitches to whatever works for your project. So please don't feel like you have to stay stuck to that particular stitch width that I suggested. I also recommend that you do a sample first before you start appliquing your actual project together. And this one's a bit of a controversial opinion. A lot of people like to match their threads to their center applique project. I personally like to match my thread to the background fabric. And the reason for that is if my stitch meanders a little bit, it is easier to miss if that stitch goes into that background fabric. And I don't find that I meander into my applique project. So a lot of people match their threads to the inside. I match my thread to the back side. And finally, if it is December 2022, you have an opportunity to enter an applique contest being put on by Michael Miller Fabrics. I will link to a video in the description down below, and in that video you can learn all about that contest, and it is a beginner-friendly project. So I hope that you'll check out their video, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.